Jake Morrison wiped the dust from his hands as he walked into the spaceport cantina, and the smell of alien liquor and burnt food hit him hard. But he was too tired to care, because 18 hours of fighting with broken irrigation systems had left him empty and ready for just one drink before the long ride back to his farm that was barely producing enough to keep him fed. Cantina was busier than usual, with 3 merchant ships docked at the small colony port and their crews spending credits on whatever helped them forget the long jumps between stars, and Jake found a quiet corner booth ordering cheap whiskey that tasted like recycled fuel but burned going down, which was all that mattered. "Human, you play cards?" a voice asked. And Jake looked up to see a Virixian standing over him with scales that gleamed dark green under the dirty lights and eyes that looked at Jake like he was just another piece of cargo to be bought or sold. Jake shrugged because he knew some poker from his days before the colony, before his wife Sarah died and left him alone on a farm that was supposed to be their dream together, and now playing cards seemed like a better way to waste time than sitting alone with his thoughts. The Virixian captain, whose name was Kretch, led him to a back table where 4 other alien traders sat with piles of credit chips and strange items that Jake could not identify but clearly held value among spacers who dealt in goods most colonies never saw. They dealt them in, and Jake played careful at first, feeling out how these aliens bluffed and bet because cards were cards, but reading faces across species took concentration, and he lost the first 2 hands small before he started to understand that. The Thoraxian clicked his mandibles when nervous, and the Urix female flared her neck frills when she had. Good cards. An hour passed then too, and Jake found himself winning more than losing, because years of dealing with crop failures and equipment breakdowns had taught him to keep his face neutral, even when everything inside him was screaming, and the other players started to respect his cold human expression that gave nothing away. Them pot grew larger with each round as players threw in advanced power cells that could run his farm for a year, and nav computers worth more than his entire property, and credit chips that represented amounts Jake had not seen since before Sarah got sick, and they spent everything trying to save her. Then Kretch, the Virixian captain, raised the stakes in a way that made the whole table go quiet, because he gestured to one of his crews standing near the door and said, "I add 1 indentured servant to the pot. Calrathi female, young and healthy, worth 30,000 credits in any Virixian market." The crew member brought forward a woman, and Jake felt something twist in his gut, because she was humanoid enough that her terror was readable in every line of her body, but alien enough that her skin held faint patterns that seemed to shift colors from gray to dark blue, and her eyes were larger than human eyes, reflecting the cantina lights like mirrors. "She is legal property under Virixian law," Kretch continued, placing a data chip on the table registered, "and contracted for another 8 cycles of service, and I include full transfer of ownership rights to the winner." The other players shifted uncomfortably because slavery was technically illegal in Earth colonies, but indenture contracts from other species were a gray area that colonial authorities mostly ignored, since they had no power to enforce Earth law on alien traders just passing through. Should have folded right there, because he had no business getting involved in whatever horrible situation this woman was trapped in, but something about the way she stood with her shoulders pulled in, her luminescent skin patterns going darker and darker, made him think of Sarah and how she looked those last days when the plague was taking her, and she knew no one was coming to help. Call, Jake said, pushing all his winnings into the center and meeting Kretch's eyes with a steady gaze that he did not really feel, because his heart was hammering, and he knew this was the stupidest thing he had done since leaving Earth. The cards came down, and Jake had 3 queens sitting pretty well. Kretch showed 2 pair, and the Virixian captain's scales rippled with anger, but he nodded, lowly, because whatever else Virixians were, they honored their contracts and bets in front of witnesses. "She is yours, human," Kretch said, standing up and gesturing at the woman. "Her name is Zara, and you will find she has some useful talents. If you do not break her first, because her people are fragile." Despite what the slavers claim, the other players dispersed quickly, sensing that the friendly game had turned into something darker, and Jake found himself standing with a data chip containing transfer documents and a terrified alien woman who was looking at him like he was death itself come to collect. They walked to the cantina exit, and Jake could feel eyes following them, because news traveled fast in small colonies, and by morning everyone would know that the lonely human farmer had won himself an alien girl in a card game, and they would make all kinds of assumptions about what he planned to do with his. Hover truck sat in the parking area covered in dust from the fields, and Jake opened the passenger door gesturing for Zara to get in, but she hesitated, looking between him and the open colony spaces beyond, like she was calculating whether running would be worse than whatever he had planned. "I am not going to hurt you, Jake," said slowly, because he did not know if she understood standard, but he tried anyway. "You can sit in the truck, or you can run, but if you run, you will probably get picked up by someone worse than me." Zara stared at him for a long moment, and her skin patterns flickered through colors Jake could not read before she slowly climbed into the truck, pressing herself against the far door as far from him as the small cabin allowed. Jake started the engine and pulled out onto the dirt road that led away from the spaceport toward his farm. 20 kilometers into the colony's agricultural zone, and the silence between them felt heavy, like a physical thing pressing down on his chest above. Then the colony's 2 moons rose over the horizon, casting strange double shadows across the alien landscape, and Jake wondered what the hell he had just gotten himself into, while beside him, Zara sat rigid and waiting for whatever horror came next, because in her experience that was all humans ever brought. Part 2. Breaking Expectations, the ride back to the farm took 30 minutes through dark fields where earth crops struggled to grow in alien soil, and Jake kept his eyes on the road while Zara pressed herself against the passenger door like she could disappear into the metal if she tried hard enough, and her skin patterns stayed that dark, fearful gray that made Jake's chest ache. His farmhouse appeared over a small rise, looking small and worn under the double moonlight, with peeling paint and a porch that sagged on one side, because he had not had time or energy to fix it since Sarah died, and now he was bringing another person into this lonely place, and he had no idea what came next. Jake parked the truck and climbed out, but Zara did not move until he walked around and opened her door, and even then she got out slowly, like she expected him to grab her, but he just stepped back, giving her space, and gestured toward the house. Inside, the house was clean enough, because Jake kept things organized even if he did not care much about comfort anymore, and he led Zara through the small kitchen, past the living room with its old furniture and family photos, to the guest bedroom that had been Sarah's craft room before the plague. "You can sleep here," Jake said, opening the door to show a simple room with a bed and a window that looked out over the fields, and a small closet that still held some of Sarah's things he could not bring himself to remove. Era stepped inside and turned in a slow circle, taking in the space with those large reflective eyes, and her skin patterns flickered briefly to a lighter shade before dropping back to gray, like she had caught herself hoping and remembered hope was dangerous. Jake went to the closet and pulled out some of Sarah's old clothes, because they looked about the same size, and he laid them on the bed, saying these should fit, and the bathroom is across the hall, and there is a lock on this door. And he made sure she saw him point to the lock, because he wanted her to understand she could keep him out if she wanted. She stared at the lock, then at him, and her expression was confused, like this did not match whatever she had been expecting, and Jake felt tired down to his bones, so he just said, "Get some rest," and left, pulling the door closed behind him. In his own room, Jake sat on the edge of his bed and looked at the data chip containing Zara's indenture papers, and he felt sick, because he now legally owned another person, at least according to Vrixian law, and he had no idea how to fix that, but he was too exhausted to figure it out tonight. Sleep came hard, and when Jake woke with the dawn, he went through his normal routine, making coffee and starting breakfast, and trying not to think too hard about the terrified alien woman sleeping in his guest room, who probably thought he was going to hurt her, or worse, he was scrambling eggs when Zara appeared in the kitchen doorway, moving silent as a ghost, and her skin patterns were still that cautious gray, but her eyes tracked everything, like she was mapping escape routes and cataloging potential weapons. "You hungry?" Jake asked, keeping his voice casual, and he gestured to the food he was making, which was just eggs and toast, because that was all he usually bothered with. Zara nodded slowly, and Jake set a plate for her at the small kitchen table and served the food before taking his own plate and sitting across from her, but not too close, because she clearly needed space. She ate like she was starving, taking small, careful bites at first, then faster when nothing bad happened, and Jake noticed how thin she was under those clothes, and how her hands shook slightly, and he felt anger rise in him at whatever Kretch and the others had done. To her, the next few days fell into an awkward pattern where Jake went about his farm work, fixing equipment and checking crops and trying to keep the irrigation system running, while Zara stayed mostly in the house, watching him through the windows, but never coming outside. He assigned food for her and made sure she had everything she needed, but he did not push conversation because she looked ready to bolt any moment, and he figured she needed time to understand he was not like whoever had owned her before. On the fourth morning, Jake was working on a broken irrigation pump that fed water to his southern field, and the work was hot and frustrating because the pump was old and parts were expensive, and he was lying in muddy water trying to reach a stuck valve when he heard footsteps. Zara. She stood at the edge of the trench looking down at him, and her skin patterns had shifted to a lighter shade with hints of pale blue, and she said in halting standard, "I can help," and her accent was strange but understandable. Jake sat up, surprised because she had barely spoken before, and he said, "You know about irrigation?" And he tried not to sound doubtful. "But this was specialized work, my people feel. Energy flows," Zara said, and she knelt at the trench edge, extending one hand toward the pump. "We can sense where systems fail, where water moves wrong," and her skin patterns began to glow faintly with soft light that pulsed in rhythm with something Jake could not perceive. She closed her eyes, and after a moment said, "The valve is not stuck. It is corroded, and the seal behind it is broken, which causes pressure to drop," and she pointed to a section of pipe Jake had not checked, yet Jake opened that section and found she was exactly right, and together they repaired the pump in half the time it would have taken him alone. And when water finally flowed properly through the system, Zara's skin patterns brightened to warm amber like sunrise that evening. Jake made dinner and actually tried to cook something decent instead of just throwing food together, and when they sat down to eat, he asked, "Where are you from?" and his voice was gentle, because he did not want to push, but he wanted to understand. Zara was quiet for a long moment, and her patterns shifted through several colors before she started talking, and her voice was soft but steady as she described her homeworld Calrath, where gardens grew in harmony with her people's empathic abilities, and families lived in harmony with nature and each other. She told him about the day the Vrixian ships came and how they took everyone young and healthy and scattered them across the galaxy, selling them to whoever had credits, and how she had been passed between 3 owners in as many cycles in each. One had treated her like property because that was what she was under their laws. Jake listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he told her about Sarah and how they had come to this colony together, full of dreams about building something new, and how the plague had taken her and left him alone in a place that felt too big and empty. I am sorry," Zara said, and her patterns glowed soft blue, which Jake was learning meant sadness or sympathy. "Losing your mate must hurt deeply." "It does," Jake admitted, "but it is getting a little easier," and he realized as he said it that it was true, because having someone else in the house had made the silence less crushing, even if that someone was a terrified alien woman who did not trust him yet. Sad and comfortable quiet after that, and outside the windows the double moons rose over fields that were starting to look healthier thanks to Zara's help, and Jake thought maybe this strange situation might turn into something good if he could just prove to her that not all humans were monsters. Part 3. Building something new. 2 weeks after the poker game, Jake drove into the colony's small town for supplies, and he noticed people staring at him more than usual. And at the general store, old Chen behind the counter gave him a strange look when he came in to buy seed packets and equipment lubricant. "Heard you won something interesting at cards," Chen said, and his tone was careful, like he was fishing for information. "Folks are talking." Jake felt his jaw tighten because he could guess what folks were saying, and he put his purchases on the counter and said loud enough for the other customers to hear, "I want a person who is being treated like cargo, and she is working my farm as a free partner, and anyone who thinks different can come say it to my face." The store went quiet, and Chen's eyebrows went up, but he just nodded and rang up the purchases, and Jake left feeling angry at people who would assume the worst, but also aware that his situation looked bad from the outside because most humans who bought Kalrathi did not do it for noble Reasons when he got back to the farm. Zara was working in the garden plot behind the house where she had been experimenting with earth vegetables and trying to help them adapt to the alien soil, and her skin patterns glowed warm gold in the sunlight, which Jake had learned meant she was content and focused. He found her kneeling between rows of struggling tomato plants with her hands pressed to the soil and her eyes closed, and the plants around her looked healthier than the ones beyond her. Reach and Jake still did not understand how her abilities worked, but he was grateful for them. Zara, he called, and she looked up with a smile that was becoming more common these days. Can we talk? They sat on the porch, and Jake tried to find the right words because this conversation felt important, and he did not want to mess it up. And finally, he just said, you can leave any time, right? And I will give you credits for the work you have done and help you get wherever you want to. Zara's patterns flickered through several colors, and her expression was confused, like she had not considered this, and she said, You do not want me to stay. That is not what I mean, Jake said quickly. I just want you to know you have a choice. Because you are not my property and I am not your owner. And if you stay, it should be because you want to, not because you think you have to. She was quiet for a long time, looking out over the fields that were greener and healthier than they had been in years, and finally she said, What if I want to stay, but also want to eventually earn enough to search for my family? And what if I want both things? Jake felt relief wash through him because the thought of her leaving had created an empty feeling he did not want to examine too closely, and he said, Then we make a real agreement, and I will pay you half of everything the farm earns, and we work together as partners, and you can save your share for whatever you want. Half, Zara said, and her patterns flashed bright with surprise. That is too much, it is fair, Jake said, because without your help this farm would fail and I would lose everything, and with your help we might actually make something work here. They shook hands. On it, which Zara had learned was a human way of sealing agreements, and Jake felt like maybe he had done something right for the first time since Sarah died, because giving Zara real choice and real partnership felt good in a way that charity or pity never could. Over the next month, the farm transformed, and Zara's empathic connection to living things made crops flourish in ways Jake had never managed alone, and she could sense exactly when plants needed water or nutrients or rest, and she taught him to read the subtle signs that his human senses missed. But it was not just the farm that changed, because Zara also started to take over the parts of running a household that Jake had been ignoring, and she cooked meals using techniques from her home world adapted to Earth ingredients, and the food was better than anything Jake had eaten since Sarah died. She organized his chaotic record-keeping and fixed small broken things around the house and brought life back to spaces that had felt dead for 2 years, and Jake found himself looking forward to coming in from the fields, because someone would be there to talk to and share meals with. They developed evening routines where they would sit on the porch after dinner, and Zara would teach him about Kalrathi culture and meditation techniques and the complex language of her skin patterns, while Jake taught her more standard and told her stories about Earth and showed her human music that made her patterns dance with colors. Other farmers started to notice the change in Jake's property, and a few came by to ask questions, and Zara shyly offered advice about working with the soil and reading plant needs, and word spread that the Kalrathi woman at Morrison's farm knew things worth learning. One afternoon, a colonial marshal named Williams stopped by on routine patrol, and he asked to speak with Jake privately, and his expression was serious as he said, I need to make sure everything here is legal and consensual. Jake brought out the data chip with Zara's indenture papers, and Williams reviewed them and frowned, because Vrixian contracts were technically valid in colonial space even if they made everyone uncomfortable, and he said, These show you own her, watch this. Jake said, and he called Zara over, and she came with her patterns, showing curiosity, not fear, and Jake held up the data chip and said, This paper says, I own you, but I do not believe people can be owned, so I am going to destroy it, and he snapped the chip in half in front of William. Zara's patterns exploded into bright colors. Jake had never seen swirling golds and silvers and pure white, and her eyes went wide, and she said, You are releasing me. You were already free, Jake said, but now there is no paper that says different, and Marshal Williams here is witness that you work for me by choice and can leave any time. And you owe me nothing. Williams made notes in his official log, and he looked at Zara and said, "Do you confirm this is your choice to be here?" "Yes," Zara said, and her voice was strong. "Jake treats me with respect and pays me fairly, and I choose to stay after Williams left." Zara stood in the middle of the kitchen with tears running down her face and her patterns glowing so bright they cast light on the walls, and she said, "I have not been free since my world fell, and I forgot what it felt like." That night they sat on the porch longer than usual and watched the double moons rise over fields that were thriving, and Jake felt something shift between them, like they had moved from being two lonely people sharing space to being actual partners building something together. "Thank you," Zara said softly, and her patterns glowed warm amber in the darkness, "for seeing me as a person when you could have seen me as property. Thank you." Jake replied, "For staying when you could have run, and for bringing this place back to life." They sat in comfortable silence after that, but Jake was aware of Zara beside him in a way that felt different from before, and he wondered if she felt it too. This growing connection that was more than just partnership, but he did not say anything because some things needed time to develop naturally, like crops growing in good soil with patient care. Part 4. When the past comes calling. 6 months passed and the farm produced the best harvest Jake had seen since arriving on the colony, and other farmers came regularly to learn from Zara, who taught them patiently about reading soil and understanding what growing things needed in her. Reputation spread beyond their small settlement to other agricultural zones. Jake watched Zara bloom into confidence as she found purpose in teaching and helping others, and her skin patterns stayed bright, most days glowing with warm colors that meant contentment and belonging. And sometimes when she smiled at him across the dinner table, Jake felt his chest tighten with feelings he was not quite ready to name. They were working the northern field on a warm afternoon when Jake saw 3 ships descending toward his farm, and his stomach dropped because he recognized the lead vessel. And it was Kretsch's merchant cruiser, with 2 enforcer escorts flanking it, like sharks following a bigger predator. "Zara, get in the house," Jake said quietly, and his voice was tight with controlled fear. "Lock the doors and stay inside no matter what happens." Her patterns flashed to alarmed red and blue, and she said, "What is wrong?" But she was already moving toward the house because she trusted Jake's instincts. The ships landed in his fields, crushing crops under their landing gear, and Jake felt anger rise hot in his throat, but he kept his face neutral as Kretsch descended the ramp with 4 armed crew members behind him, and the Vixian scales gleamed dark green in the sunlight. "Human," Kretsch said, and his voice carried threat like a physical weight. "You have something that belongs to me." "I do not," Jake said, standing his ground. "I won her fair in a card game, and then I freed her, and she stays here by choice." "The indenture contract was Vrixian legal property," Kretsch said, pulling out a data pad. "And according to Vrixian law, such contracts can only be dissolved by payment of the original debt plus accumulated interest, or by transfer to another legal owner within Vrixian jurisdiction, and your destruction of the transfer chip was meaningless under our law." Jake felt cold wash through him, because he had not considered that different species had different legal systems, and that his symbolic gesture might mean nothing outside Earth law. And he said how much. Kretsch smiled, showing too many teeth. Anne said original debt was 30,000 credits, and with 6 months interest at standard rates, plus penalties for breach of contract, the total comes to 55,000 credits payable immediately, or I take her back 55,000. Credits was more than Jake's entire farm was worth, and more than he could earn in 5 years, even with the improved harvests. And he saw his options collapsing like a dying star and said, "I do not have that then." "She comes with me," Kretsch said, gesturing to his crew. "We leave in 3 days to allow you time to reconsider. But if you do not produce payment, we will take her, and we will also file charges with Vrixian authorities about contract violation, which could bar you from trading with any Vrixian-affiliated worlds." Marshal Williams arrived an hour later after Jake called him, and he reviewed Kretsch's documents, and his expression was grim as he said, "This is legal under the treaties we have with Vrixian merchant clans, and I do not have authority to intervene, and if you resist, they can level this farm, and Earth naval forces are 3 weeks away at best." Jake sat at his kitchen table with his head in his hands, because he had tried to do the right thing and now it was all falling apart, and Zara sat across from him with her patterns flickering through dark colors, and she said, "Let me go, and I will not let you lose everything for me." "No," Jake said, and his voice was fierce. "I did not free you just to send you back to slavery, and we will find a way over the next 2 days." Jake liquidated everything he could sell, and he took his farming equipment to the trading post and got a fraction of what it was worth, and he sold next. Seasoned seed stock and his spare hover truck and even Sarah's jewelry that he had kept locked in a drawer for 2 years. Other farmers heard what was happening, and they contributed what little they could spare because Zara had helped them all, and they respected Jake for treating her right, but colonial farmers barely made enough to survive, and their combined donations only added a few thousand credits to Jake's total. On the morning of the 3rd day, Jake had 42,000 credits, and he was still 13. 1,000 short, and he sat on his porch watching the sun rise over fields that would probably fail next season without proper equipment, and he felt defeat settling into his bones then. Something unexpected happened, and Marshall Williams drove up with a datapad showing an account that had received anonymous deposits overnight, and credits had appeared from sources across 3 sectors in amounts ranging from 50 to 500, and Williams said word got out through the Calrathi networks. More credits came through the morning as other freed or escaped Calrathi heard about Zara's situation and pooled resources they had been saving for their own freedom or family searches, and even some rough spacers from the cantina who had been at that poker game sent money with messages saying things like the human played fair and nobody deserves to go back to Kretch by noon. Jake had 56,000 credits, and his hands were shaking as he loaded the certified credit chip because he had not expected the community he and Zara had built without realizing it to come through like this. He walked into the cantina where Kretch was drinking with his crew, and the place went quiet as Jake approached, and he said, "I have your payment." And he placed the credit chip on the bar. Kretch's eyes narrowed, and he verified the amount on his pad, and Jake could see the Verixian had not expected this, and was disappointed to lose what he probably considered valuable property, but Verixian honor was tied to contract law, and Kretch could not refuse legal payment in front of witnesses. "The debt is paid," Kretch said slowly, and his voice held anger. "And the female is legally released from indenture," but then he leaned close and said quietly, "Helping one Calrathi will not change the galaxy, human, and those who interfere too much in alien problems tend to have accidents." "I will take my chances," Jake said, and he took the release documents that Kretch provided and walked out of the cantina into bright sunlight that felt warmer than it had any right to back at the farm. Zara was waiting on the porch, and her patterns were swirling with anxious colors, and when I saw Jake's face, she stood up so fast she almost tripped, and he held up the documents and said, "You are free and legally released, and nobody owns you." Zara's patterns exploded into brilliant colors, and she ran too. Jake hugged him, and he held her close, feeling her shake with sobs, and she said, "I cannot believe so. Many people helped, and I cannot believe you spent everything." "You are worth it," Jake said, and he meant it because somewhere in the past 6 months, Zara had become more important to him than the farm or the equipment or even the comfortable life he had been building. They stood together on the porch as Kretch's ships lifted off and left the colony, and Jake knew they had hard times ahead because he had sold most of his equipment and had no credits for next season. But with Zara beside him, he felt like maybe they could rebuild stronger than before that. Evening, they sat on the porch as they always did and watched the double moons rise, and Zara's patterns glowed soft gold. And she said, "What do we do now?" "We start over," Jake said together, "and we figure it out as we go." Zara reached over and took his hand, and her skin was warm against his, and her patterns shifted to colors he had learned meant deep affection and trust, and she said, "Together sounds good." Part 5. Planting New Seeds. Farm looked rough in the weeks after Jake paid Zara's freedom, and with most of his equipment sold, he was back to doing things the hard way with manual labor and old tools that broke constantly, but neither of them complained because Zara was free. And that was worth more than any amount of credits or convenience. They worked side by side, rebuilding from almost nothing, and Zara used her abilities to maximize what little they had, making every seed count and every drop of water matter, and slowly the fields began to recover and produce, enough to keep them fed with a small surplus to sell one morning as Jake was fixing a fence post. A hover car arrived with government markings, and a woman in a neat suit stepped out, introducing herself as Director Chen from Earth's diplomatic corps, and her expression was businesslike, but not unfriendly as she said, "I have been hearing interesting things about this farm." They sat at Jake's kitchen table, and Director Chen explained that Earth had been looking for ways to counter the slave trade without starting wars they could not win, and that Jake and Zara's situation had gotten attention at higher levels, and she said what you did was brave and stupid in equal measure, but it gave us an idea. She laid out a proposal where Jake's farm would receive backing and protection if they were willing to work with Earth intelligence services to help other enslaved beings reach freedom, and document trafficking routes and identify traders who dealt in people. It would essentially be running a way station, Chen said, providing shelter and support for refugees while gathering information that could help shut down major trafficking operations, and we would provide equipment credits and legal protection in exchange. Jake looked at Zara and saw her patterns shifting through thoughtful colors, and she said, "I know others who are trapped like I was, and if we can help them then we should." And Jake nodded because he had never planned to become some kind of underground railroad operator, but life had a way of pushing people toward unexpected purposes. They agreed, and over the next month, the farm transformed again with new equipment that was better than what Jake had sold, and a secure shelter building disguised as a storage barn and encrypted communication equipment that connected them to networks of freed Kalrathi and other sympathetic beings across multiple sectors. First refugees arrived on a cold night 3 weeks later, and there were 4 Kalrathi who had escaped from a mining operation on a Vrixian moon, and they were malnourished and traumatized, in their skin patterns barely glowed at all. Zara took charge immediately because she understood their language and their culture, and she provided food and medical care and safe space, while Jake coordinated with Director Chen's people about getting them passage to free colonies where they could start new lives. More refugees came in the following months, and not just Kalrathi, but other species that were traded and exploited across the frontier, and Jake's farm became known in certain circles as a place where people who needed help could find safety, and someone who kept their word. The work was dangerous because traffickers did not like losing property, and twice they had close calls when hostile ships came sniffing around, but Earth's intelligence backing meant they had warning systems and protection that kept them safe through all of this. Jake and Zara's partnership deepened, and they moved together like 2 parts of the same organism, anticipating each other's needs and working in perfect coordination. And Jake could not remember the last time he felt this alive or this purposeful. One evening, after they had successfully moved a group of refugees to safety, Jake and Zara sat on their porch as they always did, and the double moons were bright overhead, casting silver light across fields that were thriving despite everything they had been through. "Why did you do it?" Zara asked suddenly, and her voice was soft but intense. "Why did you bet everything in that card game when you could have just walked away? And why did you spend yourself to nothing to free me when you could have just kept me as property?" Jake was quiet for a long time because he had asked himself the same questions, and the answers had changed as months passed. And finally he said, "When Sarah died, I thought I died too, and I was just going through motions on this farm, waiting for something to make sense again. And then I saw you standing in that cantina, looking terrified, and something in me woke up." He turned to look at Zara, and her patterns were swirling with colors he had learned to read, and he continued, "I could not be the person who walked away and let that light in. Your eyes go out, and then, as we worked together and built this life, I realized it stopped being about doing the right thing and became about you, specifically about us, and what we were creating together." Zara's patterns shifted to colors Jake had learned meant deep emotion, and she said, "In Kalrathi culture, we show our hearts through our skin, and the patterns we make and I have been glowing my feelings for you for months, thinking you understood what it meant." Jake felt his breath catch because he had noticed her patterns around him were always warm golds and soft blues and colors that seemed to reach toward him like living things, and he said, "I am just a human who needs words, but my meaning is the same end. I do not know when it happened, but somewhere between that poker game and now you became the most important thing in my Life Zara reached over and placed her hand on Jake's chest, and her patterns glowed brilliant gold, and she said, "My people believe that hearts recognize each other across any distance or difference, and I think our hearts recognized each other. That first night, even when we were both too scared and hurt to understand, they sat close together after that, with Zara's hand still on Jake's chest and her patterns painting them both in warm light. And Jake felt something settle in his soul, like a seed finally taking root after a long cold season. Over the following year, their operation grew, and they helped dozens of people reach freedom, and Jake's farm became known as Morrison's Haven in the networks of escaped slaves and sympathetic spacers, and the data they gathered helped Earth authorities shut down 3 major trafficking. Ring Zara became a symbol in the Kalrathi diaspora, and her name was spoken with reverence among her scattered people, and she used her growing influence to organize mutual aid networks and communication systems that helped Kalrathi across the frontier find each other and support each other. Found himself respected in ways that had nothing to do with farming and everything to do with being someone who actually kept his word when it mattered, and who saw people as people regardless of species or origin. Their farm prospered again, becoming a model for what could be achieved when different beings worked together instead of exploiting each other, and they employed several freed refugees who chose to stay and help with both farming and rescue operations. And the anniversary of that poker game, Jake and Zara stood in fields they had cultivated together, looking up at stars that no longer seemed quite so alien or lonely, and Jake said, "I sat down at that table expecting to waste a few hours and maybe win enough credits for new equipment. And instead, you won me," Zara said, and her patterns danced with amused colors, which was definitely more complicated than new equipment. "Best hand I ever played," Jake said, and he meant it, because this life they had built from nothing was worth more than any amount of credits or comfort, even if I did not understand what I was winning at the time. They watched as other freed Kalrathi worked the fields alongside human colonists and members of a dozen other species, all learning from each other and teaching each other and building something that looked like the future humanity claimed to want but rarely achieved. "We cannot fix the galaxy," Zara said quietly. "There are too many traffickers, too much cruelty, too many beings suffering." "No," Jake agreed. "But we can make our corner of it better, one person at a time. And maybe if enough people do that, the galaxy changes bit by bit." A ship descended toward their landing pad, and it carried 6 more refugees who had heard about Morrison's Haven and needed help, and Jake and Zara moved together to greet them, because this was their purpose now. This was what that stupid poker bet had grown into that evening, after the refugees were settled and fed. Jake and Zara returned to their porch and sat close together as they always did, and Jake thought about how Sarah would have liked Zara and how she would have approved of what they were building here. "What are you thinking?" Zara asked, and her patterns glowed soft, curious blue. "That I was alone for so long I forgot what it felt like to be part of something bigger than myself," Jake said, "and that I am grateful if Rixie and Captain was dumb enough to bet you in a card game." Zara laughed, and her patterns brightened, and she leaned against Jake's shoulder and said, "I am grateful a stubborn human farmer was brave enough to call that bet." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their small corner of the galaxy, and knowing that tomorrow would bring more work, more refugees, more danger, but also more purpose, and more proof that even broken people could build something beautiful if they were willing to try. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, and somewhere out there, other traffickers were moving other cargo and other people were suffering, but here on this small farm too, beings who had found each other by chance were making a difference, one rescue at a time. Jake looked at Zara and saw her patterns glowing with contentment and love and all the colors that meant home and belonging, and he knew that whatever came next, they would face it together, because that poker game had dealt them both the hand they needed, even if neither of them knew it at the time.